We are very excited to be here with you today. A massive thank you to the organizers and Congress for putting this together, this kind of event that brings together multiple voices from various regions. And our thanks go to the organizers, not just because we ourselves received the chance to speak, for which we are once again very grateful, but because Eastern Europe, the region that we try to represent somehow in our work, is lacking certain processes of self-historicization or effective means of writing its own history. The official apparatus is outdated and does not seem to care sufficiently about its own citizens, or let alone about its cultural actors. Its artists or independent entities suffer from this as well. So it is up to us, those who live here and deal with such matters in our work and in our day-to-day lives, to engage in processes of writing the history that happens around us, of documenting it through self-historicization, which comes in turn to, or which comes to overturn a lack of a collective history or a collective art history in general. And recording and documenting the present that surrounds us is, of course, with a careful understanding of the past and the forward-looking agenda. At the same time, is something that we have been trying to do with our magazine and also other research projects in general. But maybe to backtrack a bit and not digress, can you move the slide? Thank you. Not to digress already, we are here because we are making a magazine called Kajet, a research-driven journal that deals with Eastern European encounters and intersections, a journal that we manage to publish once a year, although we would love to be able to publish it more often. A journal that seeks to reconfigure the imagination of the region and to offer perhaps a critical exploration of contemporary Eastern Europe, while being, as I said previously, conscious of its past, of its heritage, of its marginal narratives, as well as local and parallel histories that come together with the area.
So the magazine was started a while back, and it materialized into a printed publication towards the end of 2017, when we launched our first issue, and since then it took over very quickly. It took over our lives. Meanwhile, we also put together a publishing program through which we are publishing artist books and other publications, and also a physical bookshop in the city center of Bukarest called Dispozitiv Books, where we try to bring the latest titles in terms of books and magazines, but with a focus on critical theory, politics, philosophy, contemporary art, but also fashion and pop culture, and how these manifestations of contemporary culture can be critically tackled and understood. Here are the covers of some of the titles that we managed to publish in the past 2 years. Not too many, but we have many plans for the future. We also relaunched our website not so long ago, so that we can publish online content, even if we have been quite reluctant at the beginning to go digital. And also, we launched an online archive of Romanian communist printed matter, basically of magazines, periodicals, books that were published before 1989, called Camera Arhiva, which I will talk about later on. And to go back in time, the idea to start a project about Eastern Europe came to us while we were doing our studies abroad. We used to live in the UK and the Netherlands, and this desire was triggered out of a certain kind of nostalgia, perhaps even a sense of alienation and displacement, but most definitely it was triggered by a certain kind of absence, a shortage of information. Perhaps because we felt that alternative and authentic forms of knowledge were needed about the place that we were coming from. So we took it upon ourselves and covered this gap that troubled us. I come from an economics background, but I've always been interested in this, in the cultural sector and in the arts. So I've managed to combine both while studying cultural economics. But on a more personal level, I have always been interested in this. In the ethnic melting pot that characterizes Eastern Europe, in the cultural politics of minorities, but also in representational issues and in how various forms of methodologies can be used beyond purely representational purposes. How does the other look like? How does the other speak? Or does the other even speak? Or what does the notion of otherness even mean? But more often and more likely, than how all these components are represented, I'm really interested in how they are misrepresented in contemporary society. For instance, my family comes from different parts of Europe. My grandmother comes from Albania. My grandfather comes from Greece, and they settled in Romania in the 1940s. So I'm naturally interested in these aspects of heritage, but also in how these dynamics have evolved in the last century or so, in processes of assimilation and cultural exchanges. Petrica has a background in sociology, and he is primarily interested in archives, issues of marginality, precarity, and periphery, in marginals and outsiders, and their relationship with post-socialism. But above all, we are really, really passionate about printed matter, about magazines and art books and independent publications, and about how an idea can be transformed into a material object. Nevertheless, we seem to keep going back and talking about this perhaps confusing notion, or perhaps scary to others, or simply ambiguous and highly disputed terminology that this idea of Eastern Europe embodies. Well, what is Eastern Europe after all? What does Eastern Europeanness mean? What does Eastern stand for inside this terminological umbrella that we have come to call Eastern Europe? One that is perhaps problematic and overused, one that for some it stretches as far as the Caspian Sea that borders Central Asia and Caucasia. For others, there is this thing called Mitteleuropa, or Central Europe, who refuse to be put in the same bracket as what lies further east. And after all, how come that Prague is regarded as more Eastern European than Vienna, despite it being geographically further westward?
At the same time, what if Eastern Europe is only a figment of the Cold War imagination, we ask ourselves, and at the same time, should we fall into the same traps that were developed by the Cold War division? What if the space demarcated by Churchill is nothing less but the result of Western socio-cultural production? And we think that the answer is maybe as varied and as complex as the questions themselves. And what we proclaim to do instead is to provide nuanced views and be aware of difficult or differences and maybe similarities and above all particularities, rather than provide hard facts and present them as accurate reality. We consider that it would be perhaps more productive to reconsider our own Eastern Europeanness and move beyond this paradigm of a world divided in or carved in binaries in East versus West as remnants of the Cold War, as well as in the global North and the global South as a revised way of talking about global economic differences. The East, in our perspective, is too well off to be considered part of the global South, but at the same time it is too weak and too poor to be part of the North. The East is too central and perhaps not spectacular enough to be truly considered an important part of the mainstream discourse of otherness. Yet it allegedly lacks the necessary substance to produce authentic or absolute values and authentic manifestations of culture. So a key aspect that we seem to go back to, and the key aspect that pertains to Eastern Europe seems to be its ambivalence, its hybridity, and its state of in-betweenness. At the same time, we also have to account to provide disclaimers to keep juxtaposing East and West and North and South and center and periphery in this storm of void concepts may also suggest that all conditions of marginality are slowly directed toward the same developed end, that they all have to aspire to fit one univocal and unilinear history, which in most cases is the history of the colonizing power. So we would say that contemporary world systems, whether they function in the arts, in economy, and in any other field, can alienate with a certain degree of efficiency, just like thinking in terms of developed and not yet developed can as well. Instead, what we propose is perhaps a pan-peripheral movement of solidarity that is based on, moves away from these antiquated terminologies and ideas, perhaps one that is united through transnational cooperation, and one that is anti-colonial in nature, one that borrows from the experience of the non-alignment movement, which should be on the slides now, one that fosters and cultivates a culture of peace and unity, and that provides alternatives to pre-established templates of globalization. And a good example of such a project is this East Art map, an artistic initiative by the Slovenian collective Erwin, which shows Eastern Europe taking the form of a tapestry of connections proposed in a collaborative and democratic manner. History is not given, please help construct it, they argue. And another close-up here of the same attempt to reconstruct these lost histories.
But if we were to delve into the editorial vision of the project, we have to account that each issue is evocative of the social, political, and cultural realities that dominate our time and region. So with each issue, we deal with a different theme, basically an overarching subject, what we like to call a timely and timeless topic. Timely because we choose subjects that pertain to the contemporary world, that are relevant to our present times, that people can actively relate to. And timeless because our subject matters are chosen in order to be reflected upon and read at other times as well. In this sense, we almost seek to give an archival value to our publication. So for example, in our first issue, we dealt with the topic of communities, which drew its inspiration, if we can call it that, from the migrant crisis that deeply impacted upon Eastern Europe and the world. Again, Eastern Europe was this liminal space of in-betweenness, a buffer area caught between the Oriental and the Occidental worlds.
Our second volume was conceived during times of amnesia and distress, as well as remembrance, as we were honoring 5 decades since the Prague Spring events and May 1968 political moments, a period of civil unrest and demonstrations, strikes, occupation of universities and factories, a series of challenges against traditional institutionalism in the West, as well as consumerism, and against Soviet expansion further in the East and Central Europe. So we consider these to be truly crucial events that revolutionized the way we look at utopia and utopianism. So we consider utopia a timely topic through which we can draw a line and perhaps reevaluate the Eastern European condition and its future. But as you may know, talking about utopia in a space that has first-handedly experienced utopia can be confusing. Utopia itself seems to have become utopian. Some see it as a forsaken relic of the past, others a symbol of failure or a myth that needs to be forgotten. But we, however, go for the completely opposite argumentation in our work, and we propose that in the case of Eastern Europe, it is the very troubled relationship with the notion of utopia that makes it the perfect site to delve into this. That is why, especially here, where the current state of affairs has not been great, we must continue to juxtapose the current bleak order with a better established ideal, to be hopeful and optimistic, So ultimately, we also believe that in this context, the notion of seeking an improved, a better, and above all, a utopian future is for us more relevant than ever.
The third issue was launched in the context of our commemoration of 3 decades of post-communism, 3 long decades of struggle, tension, uncertainty, and conflict in the case of some neighboring countries. The Eastern European struggle, we argue, is not that of catching up with the West, but that of maintaining life, of keeping going. And we argue that with this issue, we need to lay the foundations for a future-oriented, experimental kind of internationalism, one that bridges theory and practice in order to conceive a world that is led through indignation, solidarity, persistence, and systematic planning.
And the latest issue, the fourth one, on periphery, which was published last year, is an attempt to alert the center of the possibility that there is not one world, not one history, not one future without alternatives, but rather many different worlds that are being lived at different speeds, according to different rhythms, producing contradictory histories and futures. And for instance, the photo series by Ramin Mazur, a Transnistrian artist that also gives the cover of this issue, seeks to show how various rituals and forms of commemoration at the periphery are supposed to grapple with the past and the new, with modernity and tradition at the same time, by proposing a mix of the two. Whereas writer and curator Flora Gado provides an insightful perspective into the life of queer communities in socialist Poland, a genuine periphery when it comes to human rights, even nowadays in nowadays Poland. How personal archive can flourish and become a staple for emancipation.
Issue 5, on which you are working right now, focuses on the possibilities of the future, on what might tomorrow bring, and it seeks to provide some tentative answers to pressing questions. Are alternative possibilities still possible? How can we broaden the horizon of many emerging futures instead of a singular dogma that has been followed beyond doubt in the last 3 decades of capitalist post-socialism? For example, Russian writer Anna Tokareva comes with a captivating reinterpretation of pickling and pickles, of maturation as a technique that brings together people in her article Pickled Futurism, and argues that pickling is for the people and by the people. I also have to mention Siam Ghosh's research-based visual that documents the rejuvenation of a primeval forest outside of Warsaw, Poland, a project about cautious hope in times of a planetary crisis.
So all things considered, our project departs from this premise that there is a sharp contrast between what happens intellectually, artistically, culturally, even socially in the East, and how these ideas are being disseminated within a Western sphere of action. And we say that it is as if the traffic between Eastern outsiders and our more privileged equals that are part of this so-called European family that we are all members of works almost exclusively in one direction, as if works of art or any manifestation of culture can move only eastward, from the West to the East, whereas anything originating in the East is deemed to be mocked, ignored, rejected, appropriated, maybe absorbed and consumed, and marketed as a product but perhaps for the wrong reasons. And Kajet started precisely out of this kind of personal frustration, which, however, is not merely personal, but it is factual, and it is collective, and above all, it is transformative, because it changes the way we relate to the rest of the world, as well as the way or how the rest of the world relates to us.
So, in a nutshell, we also started this project with a manifesto in mind, an overarching agenda with its own objectives and, let's say, informal rules that drive the project forward. To bring unexplored and or neglected narratives to an English-speaking audience, to build a bridge between Eastern and Western life worlds, to expand mentalities, challenge stereotypes, and document lived experiences, to create a platform for academics to coexist with artists, to combine in-depth research with an accessible voice, to provide marginals and outsiders with an enhanced means of expression, to question, doubt, interpret accordingly everything that has to do with this space. At the same time, we are aware that we need to address the fact that the West, here represented by the English language, has done us a huge favor in spreading our Eastern European agenda to take over the world. This also makes us mindful and cautious that in order to reach one of our most important objectives, that of decolonizing Eastern Europe, the publishing industry and the way printed matter is scattered across the globe, we also have to make a compromise and accept a tender form of self-colonization. We paradoxically embrace the English language as a tool of spreading knowledge, but not as a tool that curates the East for the Western gaze. Instead of seeing this choice as a limitation or a cause of invalidating the legitimacy of our project, we acknowledge that in order to prompt any kind of social change or to stimulate any sort of shift in the discourse regarding Eastern Europe, we do not only have to appeal to as many readers as possible, but we literally have to speak a common tongue. We are aware of the complexity of these dynamics and have addressed them from the beginning. For instance, this is visible in the satirical name of the magazine, although we are quite serious in our intentions and the content that we are producing. Kajet, coming from the French word cahier, meaning notebook, is a largely invented word, one that seeks to play with the stereotypical interpretation of what the Eastern European word would look like, of what an unknown language would sound like. So in a way, we are reversing the practice of assumptions and stereotypes, and therefore we are subverting them, reclaiming the power, and taking it away from any toxic baggage, only to use it to our own advantage, to benefit those who have suffered from being subjected to similar poisonous patterns in the past. However, this does not mean that our Eastern European readership is less important. On the contrary, it transcends a simple writer-reader relationship or a publisher-audience one, as we believe that there is a certain responsibility on our behalf regarding the means through which we chose to represent other Eastern Europeans. We have an ambition to be accepted by the Eastern European community, so to speak, and for Eastern Europeans to identify with our research and projects, for them to feel represented by our work. So if this is not the case, then the magazine simply becomes useless.
So with each issue of the magazine, we ask ourselves and likewise seek to trigger other people's imagination. It may seem that this is one of the premises of the magazine, that it may seem that imagining alternatives is among the last resources we may currently have. This mutant version of neoliberalism, adapted to the local circumstances of the region, has gained its force by penetrating and occupying not only the graspable, the material, the visible, the cities and the country, but also the utopian realm of the imagination, seeking to render the imagination into this kind of sterile and meaningless void. So, and in its ability to colonize thought, this new system has eroded the raw materials of the imagination, leaving contemporary thinkers to conclude that it is easier to perhaps imagine the end of capitalism than to imagine the end of, or no, the other way around actually, yeah. To imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. So this paradoxical saying supports this. It may be that ecological apocalypse is more convenient than the fall of an economic model that has dominated the planet for centuries. And this is why the work we are doing with Kajet and other similar research projects should not be read as retrospective artifacts, but rather as speculative gestures of imagining lost pathways and lost routes. Replacing old grand narratives with newer ones is not something that we're interested in. What matters to us is that forgotten histories are resurfaced, and this singularity of history is rendered plural, that incomplete projects of the past, which missed out on their materialization, or cancelled futures, if we are to call them by name, are brought forward in critical fashion.
So we talked at the beginning about other projects through which we are attempting to critique contemporary phenomena. So another project that we would like to talk about very briefly is Camera Arhiva, which exists as a digital archive, but also in the form of a book. We would like to shift a bit the discussion towards the past and archiving, especially about the connection between archives and the future, between archives and the collective imagination, a connection that we did not directly pursue, but which materialized rather organically while we were doing our research. Camera Arhiva is an archival platform that seeks to dig, explore, investigate, and bring to light Romanian printed matter published between 1947 and 1989. It functions as a subjective research platform that is a permanent work in progress. The project uses rare editions and volumes and art-related printed matters, posters, exhibitions, exhibition catalogs, for instance, but especially day-to-day printed matter. So we seek to retrieve material traces and documents of communist everyday life, such as almanacs and journals, state periodicals and union-owned magazines, brochures and booklets, newspapers and pamphlets, fiction paperbacks, and do-it-yourself manuals. The process of selection was a very subjective one. Since the beginning, it has had a primarily artistic aim rather than a purely objective outcome. We feel that it is not our responsibility to deal with such important matters. It is the state or some sort of institutionalized initiative that should take a step forward and assume some sort of responsibility regarding the safeguarding of our shared past. We also feel that we are not the ones that should reconstruct history with a capital H, but rather only select bits and pieces that we find interesting, that appeal to our interests, slices of history that may make other people engage with the past and approach new unfamiliar grounds.
So again, a bit of a disclaimer. I seem to be exaggerating with these mea culpas, but we never assume to tell the truth or to represent history, as Laura said, with capital letters, because we don't believe in such powerful and know-it-all terminology in the first place. Our research starts from a rather simple premise that archives are rather paradoxically not mere matters of the past, but comments about the current times we are living in, and possibly, if used correctly, tools for a radical imagination of the future. So it is obvious that archives are manifesting themselves in the form of traces and fragments, that they're never holistic or objectively comprehensive or comprehensively objective either. But what is particularly and more interesting in their case is that they are composed of these sorts of ideological scraps and bits and pieces which have the potential to change how history is, on the one hand, recorded by both official and independent accounts like ours, and on the other, how history is remembered by the collective imagination. There is this famous quote by Jacques Derrida, who said that there is no political power without control of the archive, if not of memory itself. And after all, we need to be aware that the archive, just like history and other grand historical narratives, history and the archive is just another rhetorical, social, cultural construct. The archive never amounts to history with a capital H, and it should never seek to do this in the first place. The archive, just like art history, or the art canon, the archive is very tentatively selective and subjective. Instead, what our project tries to do and argues is that archives can help us reimagine cancelled futures that I mentioned earlier, futures that perhaps never came into being, to reconstruct some sort of alternative worlds that have been brushed aside from dominant narratives, that have been discarded from collective memory by the status quo and the linear understanding of history. So the act of archiving does not just mean a form of commemorating the past in a purely nostalgic fashion. We try to move away from that, but we try perhaps the act of archiving is especially a form of imagining the future, of allowing the possibility of different pasts and futures to emerge, ones that are helping with the reconstruction of a lost collective memory, and much more than that is helping us build a historical and political sense of the present. So despite being in appearance past-oriented, history-focused, the archive, we argue, gains meaning only in the present because its set of meanings is fueled by contemporary circumstances exclusively. So such is the case with our archive, which does not function as a steady and know-it-all vault of memory like most archives would proclaim. Instead, what Camera Archiva tries to do is to free archival memory from the rootedness or from its rootedness in the historical discourse.
So during our work for Kajet, we developed a strong interest in the history of Eastern European magazines and communist printed matter in general. We've always had this affinity for searching for scraps, so to speak, almost hoarding whatever brochures, postcards, or magazines others saw no potential in. These acts of throwing away and dismissing the past really annoyed us. So the project started out of a kind of disappointment with how contemporary society is dealing with our collective past and its material traces. What made matters even worse is that most institutional archives that should traditionally and ideally deal with such things are very, very slow in updating their digital methodologies. Artifacts that have so much empirical potential, that are in themselves valuable resources, have become not just devalued or almost worthless from a market-based perspective, but also meaningless to its very own owners and to a contemporary readership. We remember that in the process of gathering materials, we found quite a lot of the publications that you saw on the screen and that you can see on the archive. We found them at the dumpster near our apartment among rotten food and other disgusting stuff, which also confirms this process of devalorization that printed matter has been going through.
But certainly our digital platform and also the book seek to show the contrary, that we can learn a lot from our past and that there is a lot of significance and a lot of sense and value and lost meanings in what we have come to dismiss so easily. So in the case of the past on which the archive focuses, the future used to have a different usage, at least on a discursive level, unlike now in post-socialism when late capitalism has reduced the meaning of time into a continuous now, or in an already lost battle with the demons of the past that have been long dead anyway. The objective of capitalism with regards to the prospect of time is that of abolishing it in all its forms, unless time is there to provide economic progress, when it is used to control labor or to maximize profits. But we, as citizens of the capitalist world, have stopped thinking about utopia, about eternity, about the future altogether, as our existence has been segmented, and our sense of time as well has been segmented into mere hours, into corporate timetables, Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoint presentations, we hope unlike this one, Zoom meetings, and so on and so on. So in the modern age, it seems that nobody has time for the future any longer. with its deeply intricate layers of meaning and horizon of unfettered possibilities. Publishing the future meant for the publishers before 1989. It meant writing about the promise of emancipation, about accelerationism and the autonomous tradition, about the relationship between humankind and technology, and these are themes ever present in the material that we have archived. Our archive of the past therefore shows a society oriented toward the future, and this is why we argue before 1989 the future used to exist, and even more so, the future used to be bright, at least on a discursive level. Because, again, another disclaimer, of course, socialist Romania was not a paradise by any means, it was not, but we primarily tried to research and to focus here on the bureaucratic, on the discursive dimension of the bureaucratic regime, on the discursive mechanisms that the regime relied on how official culture communicated with the masses, with how, let's call it, this bureaucratic language was infused with speculative thinking and an openness toward possibility.
Such intentions were expressed through strong monumental forms of art, as well as a strong publishing industry, which has now decayed severely and which provided the basis for this kind of informal research we embarked on. By analyzing the Romanian publishing industry and its discourses pertaining to the future, we end up with a lost grammar that is used to deconstruct the future. Discussions about the cosmos, robots, space race, cyberculture, science fiction, satellites, the role of information in the present day, as well as about the future of the planet. In an ahead of its time take on the Anthropocene and the future of the human race on planet Earth, the archive unveils valuable discussions concerning ecological anxieties, climate change, noise, pollution, ecology, agricultural sustainability, the perils of industrialization, and how the modern man is stuck in an urban life. By focusing on these sediments of everyday material culture, we as informal archaeologists of everyday knowledge have aimed to recover some traces and reconstruct the quotidian relics. And this stream of visual and textual knowledge recharges the collective memory and contributes to the process of decolonizing histories and futures alike. And decolonizing what an archive means, but also decolonizing and freeing the imagination, while also tackling the bureaucratic imaginary in which the archive officially resides, and seeking to uncover a future that came to never be. This cover that is showing right now on the presentation is one of our favorite covers. It's a literary magazine called Secolul 20, which means the 20th century, and it is from 1978. And we have more slides coming up now, spreads from inside the book. Some are more propagandistic. They tackle everyday matters, how to take care of your dogs, how to dress elegantly, what are the haircuts of the year, and of course, what we mentioned already concerning space-related themes and the cosmos.
The dogs. The haircuts.
The haircuts of the year, yeah.
Yeah, so such research projects like the magazine and the archive and hopefully others are what we like to think of tools through which the documentation of other narratives it becomes possible. And this happens with an overt attempt to not succumb to Western expectations or taxonomies. And because of this, we like to think the magazine is necessary. And this is because art history and the art world and the publishing world, of course, are, as we said earlier, inherently selective, because the art canon itself is inherently tendentious, and ultimately because art history remains by and large Western art history. And the East, therefore, in our view, is formed of what Slovenian curator Zdenka Badovinac calls spaces of interrupted histories. Basically fragments of knowledge, practices, thoughts, discourses, modes of action that roam around the center, that sometimes collide with it, and potentially even more infrequently subvert and break its cloak of misconceptions. So like the magazine, in as much as this talk or this discussion, after all, these interrupted histories are narratives, individual but also collective, fragmented but also asynchronous, that become part of a process of self-historicization, of documenting, of remapping what we see to be neglected, ignored, or exploited. So to some extent, we are seeking to consolidate history in absentia, creating our own timeline of the past. But this is not done in an anti-empiricist or counterfeit or fake way, but in an empowering and imaginative manner, we like to think, by shifting the emphasis from totalitarian and totalizing master narratives toward micro-histories that fail to be included in the annals of modernity in the first place. So the important thing is not just to witness or document these, but to be able to develop perhaps a kind of receptive attitude toward these processes of change, to show perhaps a desperate eagerness to imagine the world other than it currently is, and to hopefully transform it. And this is because images or imagination or dialectical images, as we call them, constitute the crucial starting point for setting up a debate around modernity, a special kind of aesthetics that are at stake, a new kind of grammar, and a new kind of language. At the same time, we shall not be misled by the recent Western musealization of the East. There are theorists, for instance, Boris Groys comes to mind, who argue that this process means that the victors successfully appropriated the art of the vanquished. It also means that this so-called Eastern European art is now being classified according to Western ideals, estranging it from its original context, subduing it to alienating mechanisms to which it never, to which it does not belong. So one of the last thoughts that we want to leave you with is that greater visibility does not automatically imply greater power. The only way to fight the homogenization of knowledge and art production is by producing and documenting alternative local knowledges in the plural, as well as by networking horizontally on a transnational level, like we do now, we hope, against the vertical art canon and beyond the bounds of too much filtering by non-local institutions. Piotr Piotrowski, one of the leading art historians coming from Poland who passed away unfortunately, his usage of the word horizontality is key in transcending the simplistic dichotomies and binarisms of the East-West divide. And this is because he argues, generalized ideological context cannot help us retrieve a truly horizontal perspective. Basically, that the liberal West did not produce exclusively and only a pluralist and diversified art, whereas the socialist East at the same time did not develop only and exclusively art following uniformizing ideological prerequisites. So as a sort of conclusion, if post-socialism or if post-socialist capitalism guides the present toward one singular narrative of the future, toward the trajectory of productivity and growth and an eternal accumulation and inequality altogether, we must then rethink our mechanisms of operation. We do not need, we argue that we do need to start thinking sideways, laterally, in zigzags, rather than in unilateral and uniformizing notions. Thinking solely ahead and forward may not be such a revolutionary act after all, but by relying on sideward thinking, on including parallel and alternative thoughts and discourses and practices, and even contradictory narratives that together genuinely and truly resemble the noisy reality that we find ourselves in, we may be able to propose a response to this singular, linear, teleological understanding of time, of history, of present, and the future. And in this way, we argue the parallel coexisting imaginaries are not only embraced in the plural, but they are inevitably empowered and they are made alive. And
So thank you all for coming to our presentation. We would also like to say that we have a couple of books at the entrance that you can look through. Yeah, and yes,
thank you.
Thank you.